Hello, my name is Gary Howling. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to speak with you today, to be involved in this fantastic symposium that's being run by the Central Victorian Biolinks. I'm really excited to be able to talk about Glideways, a flagship program of the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative, which is looking to restore habitat connections for iconic gliders across Eastern Australia. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from where you're watching this presentation right now, and also the Darawal people here in the Illawarra from where I'm recording this session. Firstly, the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative. The Great Eastern Ranges Initiative was established in 2007 as a continental scale connectivity conservation initiative. We have a bold mission to bring people together to protect, link and restore healthy habitats over 3,600 kilometres from Western Victoria right the way along the Eastern Ranges to far North Queensland. The Great Eastern Ranges Initiative is in part a response to the long-held understanding that protected areas alone are not sufficient to protect nature and native species, and also that ecological processes that underpin the ecology of Eastern Australia, such as seasonal migration and movements in response to fire and other disturbances, operate across landscapes and regions and can't be constrained to individual reserves or small isolated patches. The importance of the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative for supporting wildlife movements was first highlighted in the earliest days of the initiative back in 2008, when we undertook this continental scale analysis of connectivity to show the extent of connections across natural systems in Eastern Australia. The lighter areas that you can see on this model demonstrate areas with the greatest potential for connectivity. The darker areas are also areas that are least well connected or have the least potential to support wildlife movements at large scale. As you can see from this slide, the Great Eastern Ranges support a network of complex east, west and north-south corridors right the way across Eastern Australia, from the far north right the way through to Western Victoria. That's the landscape that the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative has been working on. And now it's important when we're thinking about connections at the largest scales like this, that we also understand that we're also interested in maintaining connections and the condition and health of habitats at the local scale, the scale that actually aggregates up to provide these continental scale connections. So we're equally interested in small scale of habitat that provides stepping stones across landscapes, as we are about intact connections between areas of remnant vegetation and also large intact, physically intact landscapes that are still in good condition. So first of all, why gliders? Obviously, Great Eastern Ranges are they're the ground central for gliders in Eastern Australia. They are the habitat for most of the species, with the exception of those up in the tropical top end around Arnhem Land. So thinking about the suite of glider species, the Great Eastern Ranges are where they're from, and the conservation is so intrinsically linked to the health and sustainability of the Eastern Ranges. In terms of why gliders as well, of course, they're iconic and engaging. Who doesn't love gliders? I often tell people, if you show me somebody that doesn't love gliders, you're showing me somebody that doesn't have a heart. So they're a really engaging species that communities can engage and connect with quite easily. As I mentioned earlier, all but one of the species occurs throughout the Great Eastern Ranges landscape, and they're also emblematic of the problems facing native wildlife through that landscape, in particular, those species that require a little help getting around the landscape, i.e. require minimal gaps in the habitat connectivity to be able to ensure that they can get from one area to another. In thinking about where gliders occur, it's also clear that they correspond with some of the longest settled and most heavily intensely altered regions of Eastern Australia. The map that I'm showing you here of Australia highlights the number and pervasive distribution of the common threats to gliders spoken about by others during the course of this symposium. These range from habitat loss and fragmentation to ongoing pressures from weeds, feral animals, fire and the loss of feed species and nest hollows. Now, Glideways was established by Great Eastern Ranges Initiative in 2015 as a direct response to the types of threats impacting on gliders and also reflecting the scale of the response needed to conserve them across their entirety of their range. Glideways is comprised of a suite of projects aimed at conserving gliding possums and their habitat through targeted and complementary projects. Also, we undertake these projects across the Great Eastern Ranges. So we have a great emphasis on understanding where are the most important locations for us to be working, both at a local scale and also at a national scale. Importantly, Glideways recognises that the range of threats impacting on gliders require a suite of interventions from habitat protection to restoration and supplementation of remnant areas, suppression of threats, and in some cases, actual redesign of infrastructure such as barbed wire fences and potentially road changes over time. The knowledge and capacity needed to implement many of these different types of interventions are often held by different organisations. So Glideways projects bring different partners together to collaborate on habitat and connectivity restoration, specifically for the benefits that they provide to gliders. The Great Eastern Ranges Initiative has been working in a number of landscapes across Eastern Australia, for example, in partnership with regional networks such as Central Victorian Biolinks. Partners in many of these landscapes have either undertaken or are delivering Glideways projects designed for the species found in their particular landscape. A common feature of all of these projects is that they seek to establish corridors of effort that link up actions across the landscape to create stronger connections that enable movement of gliders and other native species. So in this particular example, this is one of the earliest projects that we were involved in and supported around glider movement down in our Slopes to Summit landscape on the Western Slopes in southern New South Wales, a landscape where we've been working over time with partners to link up Womargama National Park down at the bottom right-hand corner of that lower map with Benambra Nature Reserve up in the top left-hand corner of that upper map. And what we see in landscapes such as Slopes to Summit and with the Womargama to Benambra corridor is organisations, whether it's the Biodiversity Conservation Trust or the local land services organisation, Landcare, and the road management authorities linking up their various activities across the land holdings that they have responsibility for, so that they actually link up and create corridors of effort across the landscape. We're not just doing that kind of work in one or two locations, we're actually replicating across entire landscapes, identifying where are the key gaps, such as in the Canangara Boy to Wangla Link corridor, up on the central tablelands of New South Wales, identifying key gaps between protected areas and opportunities to be able to work across land tenures and across land holdings with private landholders and public land management authorities to link up efforts in each of those key gaps. So in the case of the Canangara Boy to Wangla Link program, for example, they've already achieved a number of contiguous connections through voluntary effort across public and private lands. Now, if you imagine replicating that across multiple landscapes, we start to have an impact, not just at a local or a regional scale, but also bringing together a package of programs under the banner of Glideways that deliver weed and pest animal control, infill feed plantings, engagement with traditional owners, community awareness raising through education programs, installation and monitoring of nest boxes, but also evolving our understanding of how we can improve on our habitat restoration into the future. So in terms of the last 5 years of Glideways effort, we've learned a lot about what it actually takes to be able to restore Glideways for gliders at a landscape scale and get that scaling up of actions. What we're finding is that Glideways is particularly important because it brings together in a given landscape the various organisations and stakeholders who are able to bring different aspects of a toolbox of actions that can be varied to suit the particular context in time or in location, and also placed to the strengths of the various organisations that are working in those particular locations. We target our interventions so that we've also got a clear basis for monitoring progress, something that I don't have too much time to talk about today. But we also look towards using an engaging species to try and mobilise project funding and support of the broader community in support of habitat restoration, which may be being expressly undertaken through glideways for gliding possums, but actually has a benefit for a whole suite of other less interesting or less engaging species that are still critical to the conservation of that particular landscape. Also, it provides us with a clarity and an understanding of how different organizations and stakeholders who are already doing things in a particular landscape can come together and engage together in a broader plan within their landscape for restoring corridors and connections for gliders. At the end of this first 5 years of Glideways implementation, it's really the need for a broader national Glideways recovery plan to bring together in a more express way an understanding of who's doing what across the landscape. So one of the outcomes that we'll be hoping to achieve beyond the life of this current symposium and with the outcomes that come out of the various workshop sessions is a better understanding of who's doing what across the broader Eastern Ranges landscape, as well as who's particularly active within the Central Victorian Biolinks. So a National Glideways Recovery Plan can acknowledge that breadth of work already underway. We can also then use that to highlight any key gaps, opportunities, or priorities for management into the future and provide a framework that can link those various efforts across landscapes that provides as well an engaging call to action for communities aspired to get involved in glider conservation in their local area as part of a broader plan on a national scale. I'd like to now just show you a brief video.
In the wild, a squirrel glider like moth would be feeding on small insects, so anything that can be found in the forest and stuff, but she would be loving things like grevillea flowers, wattle flowers, but she'll also be living in the hollows that are created by older trees. It takes 100 years for a tree to grow a really great hollow and create that little secure home that an animal like a squirrel glider needs. We may be planting trees, but sometimes we're not even letting them get to 100 years old to create those habitats. We have 6 species of gliders in Australia, and the squirrel gliders are the second smallest. They used to range all along the eastern seaboard, but they've come under a lot of threat and you don't find them in urban areas anymore. You need to go further afield to the Great Eastern Ranges, Copperhania Reserve, that kind of area, to find them in their natural habitat.
I live on a farm in the Great Eastern Ranges, and I've noticed, decline of species, particularly, little birds and things like that. So I guess that's what really drove me to get involved in this project and, see how we can make a difference. So we're here at Taronga Zoo today to launch our Glideways program, which is the next step in protecting and conserving the habitat, particularly for gliders in this landscape. Through our Glideways program, we're going to run a series of projects, including putting in nest boxes, collaborative pest and weed management, and revegetation. So we're working in the Great Eastern Ranges initiative, which is a project which runs actually 3,600 kilometres from the Grampians in Victoria all the way to Queensland. We're working on just a small part of it, which is the Canangara Boy to Wangla link. It starts at Greater Blue Mountains area and all the way to the Wangla Dam. We've been working in this area since 2012, restoring habitat connections. We've already done 380 hectares of re-veg and over 4,000 hectares of weed control and collaborative pest control over the whole of the Canangara Boy to Wangla link. What we're doing to help the gliders will actually help a whole range of other species which have similar habitat requirements.
Project Habitat, supported by Boeing Australia, has become our avenue to assist communities like Canangara Boy to Wangla to create corridors and nature pathways for these animals to act as a bridge between one habitat area and another. Copperhania is a beautiful reserve and needs some support in these corridors. Squirrel gliders are a beautiful species. They're adorable to look at. They're so iconically Australian, but not every Australian knows about them, so we want them to have a bigger place on our map. If we can help our squirrel gliders, so many other species that rely on the same sort of habitat and resources will be affected as well. So they're doing such great things for a bigger cause.
Thank you for listening.